Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The 2022 Winter Olympics have kicked off in Beijing. Many world leaders attended the opening ceremony, thousands of athletes are participating, and millions of people will watch from around the world. Meanwhile, in the northwestern Xinjiang region of China, the government is implementing policies that many human rights organizations and foreign governments have determined amount to crimes against humanity and even genocide against the Uyghur people. The juxtaposition of this internationally celebrated Olympics in the midst of an ongoing human rights calamity is what drives our conversation today with four different speakers. Rushan Abbas is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs. Teng Biao is a Chinese human rights lawyer and the Posen visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Yaqiu Wang is the senior China researcher for Human Rights Watch, and Sean Roberts is a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University and author of the book The War on the Uyghurs. We recorded our conversation live on Twitter Spaces just before the opening ceremony, and this episode kicks off with Rushan Abbas explaining the circumstances of her sister's enforced disappearance in Xinjiang. Just a quick note before we start. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. Be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you are listening to get episodes as soon as they are released. Subscribing to the podcast as opposed to just listening to individual episodes ad hoc will also open up our huge archive of past content. I've been publishing 2 episodes a week every week since about 2013. And chances are, if there's a topic in international affairs which you are interested in, I've covered it. So just subscribe or follow the podcast, depending on the platform you use. The term of art differs in order to access that whole archive. All right. And now here is Rushan Abbas, founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs.
So today I am advocating for Uyghur people at the cost of my own sister's freedom. As sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, she was taken just 6 days after I participated on a panel at the Washington, D.C. Hudson Institute, and I talked about the genocidal policies of the Chinese government and the talking about the current situation, the conditions of the concentration camps, and outlining the fate of my in-laws, which my husband's entire family was missing since summer of 2017. Just 6 days after that speech, my own sister, a retired medical doctor, was taken from her home. She worked previously in a state-run hospital, and she retired early age due to the health reasons. So it has been more than 42 months now, and still there's absolutely no trace or word on her whereabouts. And we learned in December 2020 that my sister Gulshan Abbas was sentenced harshly on the false charges with a secret trial with no evidence or no proof of life or a disclosure of her location where she's being held. So basically, she became a victim of the CCP's reprisal for my activism in the United States, and they are holding her as hostage.
And to be clear, do you know where she is located right now?
No, unfortunately, I don't. We don't know where she's being held at.
And can you just maybe describe for the audience, the process you went through to try to learn about the whereabouts or the circumstances of, your sister? I mean, it seems as you describe it, she's vanished into this like black hole.
Yeah, exactly. As I mentioned earlier, just 6 days after my speech, my sister and my maternal aunt, my mother's sister, they both were taken from two different cities, about 1,400 kilometers away from each other. Basically, my two closest living relatives back home. And then when I find out that they were missing, I waited for 5 weeks because my nieces, my daughters, my sister's two daughters, they both live in the United States, one in Virginia and one in Maryland. And they did not want me to be vocal about this case because they were scared something bad might happen to their mother, or they felt that maybe the government took her to just questioning her and they may release her in a few days later. So they wanted me to wait, and we waited for 5 weeks, but no word, nothing. So I wrote an op-ed published at Washington Post, and I gave interview to New York Times. Then I have been speaking publicly and using the social media as a platform to raise her case while raising the millions of other innocent Uyghurs being held in concentration camps. Then what that resulted was they released my aunt in February, basically 4 or 5 months after the detention. They released my aunt, but absolutely no response, nothing on my sister's case. So,
do you have any sense of like why they would release your aunt but not your sister?
Because I was making a big deal out of how these two women from far away from each other, one from Urumqi, capital city, one from Atush, a town near Kashgar, which is, nothing to do with each other. Two women, both are related to me. Both of them are unusual targets because they both aren't famous. They are not educators or writers or scholars. Neither has traveled to any foreign Muslim majority countries, and they both speak fluent Chinese. And they both had a professional life. My sister is retired medical doctor. My aunt is retired school teacher. She's 60 some years old. So I was making this point as these two women were targeted because of me, because of my activism. This is a retaliation for an American citizen exercising the freedom of expression, freedom of speech in the United States, and my relatives got targeted. So I think they just tried to take that point away from me that these two women from two cities disappeared on the same day, and they released my aunt.
What has the search for your sister, and your generally, more broadly speaking, your activism around this issue revealed to you about the circumstances of Uyghurs in Xinjiang? In looking for your sister, have you learned anything sort of new or different about the Chinese government's oppression in this region?
Mark, be honest with you, unfortunately, this is nothing new. And I have been an activist from the time that I was a university student when I was living in back home and going to school in Xinjiang University. And the China's genocidal policies started to implement from the time that in the early 2012, when the Chinese government implemented a punishment on the spot policy, which means any armed forces could kill any Uyghur if they feel that the person is not following their orders. For example, if a traffic policeman could kill you if you ran the red light or you are speeding, or if they try to arrest you if you resist because you are innocent. Radio Free Asia Uyghur service reported that an Uyghur teenager was shot to death by a traffic policeman when he ran a red light on his motorcycle. So any special forces and the armed police can raid into any Uyghur homes at any time they want, search and arrest as they wish, and kill as they wish. And even a high-level Chinese government official, Hu Lianghe, said actually in one of the Chinese media that the Uyghur situation should be taken to a final solution stage, basically referring to Nazi policy did when they were exterminating the Jewish people.
So you earlier mentioned that your in-laws have also been targeted and arrested or detained. Are you comfortable? Are you able to speak about what's happened to them?
Yes, absolutely. My husband has been being very vocal about it too. He wrote the book called Menace, China's Colonization of the Islamic World and the Uyghur Genocide. And he talks about his family and what happened to them. Since April 2017, my parents-in-laws, 3 of my husband's sisters, their husbands, his brother, and the sister-in-law, and the 14 of nieces and the nephews, total of 24 people, they all disappeared. They live in Hotan, a town in the southern part of East Turkestan. We call East Turkestan because Xinjiang is a colonizational name, means new territory, new border in Chinese. So they were taken. The entire house, they lived in a big house in like a courtyard house all together in like very traditional style. He has been told months and months after he lost contact with his family, he couldn't get hold of anyone, nobody's phone or home phone, nothing is working. So finally, when he was contacting some distributors in abroad and in China proper, he has been told that there was a lock in his house, basically. Nobody was there. So probably the kids, the nieces and nephews were taken to the state-run orphanages as a part of about 1 million Uyghur children sent to government-run orphanages. And who knows, his brother and the sister-in-law and the sisters and the brother-in-laws, they all sent to the forced labor facilities, as millions of Uyghurs are used as a modern-day slavery today, making this genocide a profitable venture for the Chinese government.
And I just want to note that a previous episode of my podcast focused on these state-run orphanages in which Uyghur children have been separated from their parents, taken to these orphanages. I'll post a link to that on Twitter after this conversation concludes. What's next for you in terms of your search for your sister and your efforts on behalf of both your family members and other Uyghurs? How are you sustaining your campaign?
The Chinese government is getting away with this modern day genocide, and not just getting away, but when you look at it, they are starting the opening of the Olympic Games, which means they are getting rewarded for targeting one ethnicity because of their religion, because of their culture and language. The reason that they are getting away is because there are a lot of talks, but no tangible action. And they also, the Uyghur situation is known as like a top to bottom situation for most of the countries and most of the regions. A lot of governments and the leaders and people who are directly involved in China or human rights situation know what's happening, but majority of the general public, civic societies, grassroots organizations still unaware of the genocide the Uyghurs are facing. So my goal is trying to engage the civic societies and raise awareness, educate the general public, and tell them, exposing the China's genocidal policies and crimes against humanity. So right now, actually, I'm in Zagreb, in Croatia. And from here, next stop is Czech Republic, and from there to Slovakia. So just to try and use every opportunity to educate the general public so they can talk to their lawmakers and their leaders to take action and hold China accountable.
Well, this conversation is certainly, hopefully, part of that effort. I would like to bring into the conversation now Teng Biao, and Rushan, please do stay if you can.
Thank you. My name is Teng Biao. I'm a human rights lawyer from China, currently teaching at Hunter College and the University of Chicago.
So, Teng Biao, the last time that Beijing hosted Olympics back in 2008, if I'm not incorrect, you experienced firsthand the government's drive to suppress human rights defenders ahead of the Summer Games. Can you describe what happened to you back in 2008 ahead of the previous Beijing Olympics?
Yeah, I was scholar and human rights lawyer at that time, and I co-authored an article with Hu Jia, another human rights defender. It's talking about human rights situation in China before Olympics, and then later December 2007, Hu Jia was arrested and eventually got 3 years and a half. And then a few months before Beijing Summer Olympics, I was kidnapped by Chinese secret police and detained for 2 days and 2 nights. And I was threatened to be put into prison, charged with incitement of state subversion. And I was also banned from traveling internationally. And my lawyer's license was revoked 3 months before the opening ceremony. So before the Olympics in 2008, there had been many human rights defenders and activists being detained or warned, and petitioners and NGO activists were all targeted. So that's the human rights situation deteriorated before, during, and after Beijing Olympics, and also because of that Olympic Games, some people were arrested because they submit their applications of demonstration.
So that's sort of leads to my next question to you. Are you seeing a similar pattern, or have you seen a similar pattern in which a human rights crackdown has accelerated ahead of the Olympics? Because, on the one hand, you would think the opposite might be the case, that ahead of the Olympics, the government might want to sort of not take too many drastic actions so as to get into sort of bad press and whatnot. But what have you seen ahead of these coming Olympics?
I keep regular contact with Chinese human rights activists and dissidents, and almost every one of them has been warned, and some human rights lawyers and defenders have been arrested just within the past 2 months, and they were warned not to speak out before Olympics. So and for the past years, the censorship on the internet and the media has been harsher, and the many non-governmental organizations have been shut down, and religious groups were targeted, and everyone knows the Hong Kong freedom and the rule of law have been destroyed. And the Tibetan human rights situation is getting much worse, and not to mention the ongoing Uyghur genocide.
So it is accelerating the crackdown. In other words.
Yes, yeah.
Is there a specific anecdote or story you could share without putting anyone at risk of a human rights defender in China who you've been in contact with, who has been sort of gotten that knock on the door, as you said, ahead of the Olympics to stay silent?
Yes. So one of my friends is. She's from Beijing, but she's living in another city, and she was told not to go back to Beijing. and she and many other human rights defenders and bloggers were told not to do anything, not to write anything about Olympics, not to criticize the government or human rights issues. And yeah, so they all experienced the same thing.
So I know that you are among a number of human rights activists and lawyers who are pressing for minimum human rights standards for Olympic hosts. Can you sort of describe and discuss and explain what that campaign is and what you seek to achieve?
Yeah, first is China made a commitment to improve human rights and the rule of law when applying to Summer Olympics, and then they broke that promise, and the human rights was not improved, but worsened. And then this time, the genocide, Chinese government is committing the most severe crime on international law. So it's really necessary to have a minimum human rights standard for all Olympic hosts. So to host Olympic Games in a country committing genocide and crime against humanity is really against the Olympic Charter, against all those kind of human rights declarations and treaties. So I'm involving a joint article led by Professor Ross. He's now here as a listener. So it's really important to campaign that the IOC and the international community should establish human rights standard for future Olympic hosts.
Have you had any interaction to that end with the International Olympic Committee? Have you tried to reach out to them?
Since 2015, when Beijing was given the opportunity to host the Olympics again, we started our campaign, and we gave pressure to IOC and demanded a dialogue with them, but they just refused to respond until the October of 2020. And we organized more than 180 human rights organizations. We wrote open letters, and then under that kind of pressure, the IOC agreed to talk with us. So I was one of the 5 representatives of those human rights organizations, and we raised our concerns. We talked about Tibetan human rights, genocide, Hong Kong, everything. And the IOC knew that, and their message was clear. They don't care of human rights, and they won't postpone or cancel the Winter Olympics, and they won't give any pressure to Beijing. They won't talk about human rights to Beijing officials.
But they did use the opportunity to sort of advertise that they spoke with human rights defenders as a way to sort of whitewash what was happening, it seems.
Yeah, they are cooperating with Chinese government to whitewash the atrocities and the crimes, and they have gone even further, like helping Chinese government to cover up the truth of Peng Shuai case, and it's Chinese government forced Peng Shuai to be silent, and IOC under the arrangement of Chinese government talked with Peng Shuai a few times, but their message is totally false. Peng Shuai is not free, is not safe, but IOC is complicit in that crime, that suppression.
And just to be clear, for those unaware, Peng Shui is the Chinese tennis star who made accusations against senior leadership in China of sexual assault, and then was effectively silenced and sort of disappeared for a while, but then has sort of popped back up a few times, often sort of under the auspices of the Chinese government.
Yeah.
I want to bring Ya Cho Wang from Human Rights Watch into the conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yacho Wang. I'm a senior China researcher for Human Rights Watch.
Have you, or basically anyone from Human Rights Watch, had direct conversations with the IOC about human rights concerns ahead of the Olympics?
Yes, we wrote to them at the end of 2020. Then we had a conversation at the beginning of 2021, which the chairperson of the Chinese Olympics Organizing Committee, Juan Samaranch Jr. joined us. And during the conversation, he just, repeated the same old lines about, the Olympics is a force for good, things like that. But did not address anything, specifically to our concern. The crimes against humanity are happening in Xinjiang. There's no real answers to our questions, just the same old lines they repeat.
So you didn't get much headway there. So I take it that then Human Rights Watch decided to raise their concerns, your concerns, with the sponsors of the International Olympic Committee and the sponsors of the Beijing Olympics. Have you had sort of direct conversations with some of these major sponsors? Who are these major sponsors as well?
There are 13 very big companies, including Airbnb, Alliance, Coca-Cola, Intel, P&G, Visa, etc. We wrote to every one of them, asking them whether you have conducted a due diligence to make sure there's no human rights violations pertaining to your operation in China. Can you pressure the IOC to do better on human rights because you are paying for the games, right? You have leverage. We wrote to every one of them. Only Alliance responded to us with the generic lines.
Then we also, that big insurance company, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Then we also wrote to NBC, which is the broadcaster of the Olympic Games. I think about 40% of IOC's revenue is from NBC. So they respond to us too, but with more the generic lines about we care about human rights. We have conducted due diligence, but then we ask them, can you be more specific of the due diligence you carried out? Can we know more details? And then there's no further discussion on that.
So basically, there has been no real effort on the part of sponsors to use whatever leverage they might have to raise human rights concerns.
That's our understanding, or at least, they have not communicated to us or publicly about what they're doing. But, I doubt, there are things that, I doubt they are doing the kind of human rights due diligence we're asking them to do. I wish they would be more. If they were doing it, I would expect them to be more, public about the good things they're doing.
Well, what does that sort of reluctance to, use whatever commercial leverage they have to press for human rights in China sort of reveal to you more broadly about how major corporations, are approaching China?
Well, it all says because they care so much about the, market access because there's so much money to be made in China. And the Chinese government has a history of using, economic leverage, using market access to pressure companies and countries for all kinds of political goals. It's very interesting. I have to mention that, Intel, which is one of the top sponsors. So after the U.S. government passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which, in effect ban imports from Xinjiang, the company wrote a letter to its its partners in the supply chain, saying, make sure that you're not source anything that is related to forced labor or from Xinjiang. And then, that letter itself, basically letter say, be careful, make sure that, no forced labor is involved in your supply chain. That letter, made people in China upset. Then Intel has to apologize for writing that letter. You can see the degree of companies being afraid of upsetting the Chinese government.
On this question of forced labor in supply chains, do you have a sense of the extent to which slavery is corrupting and forced labor is corrupting global supply chains throughout throughout the world? Is there any research that suggests to you, for example, like the cotton industry, which I know is big in that region, or other manufacturing exports are corrupted by slavery in the supply chain?
Yes, there are good research, and there's an organization called, the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. It's a coalition of different organizations. They have done, research on this issue. Especially on the issue of cotton. I think, they are the cotton, also what's the English word of there's a component of solar panel. Half of the component of 4 solar panel were also made in Xinjiang. So there are very good evidence to say, some of the, materials that was sold by big companies involved some forms of forced labor. This is one thing. Their research show that. Secondly, that auditing is very, very hard in Xinjiang. So, several big auditing companies said, we can't really access the region to do sufficient due diligence. So, we are quitting doing this in Xinjiang for big companies. And I think it's probably going to become more and more difficult to do this satisfactory due diligence to make sure forced labor is not involved in Xinjiang.
Yeah, it seems on the one hand, auditors are excluded from the region, but even if you are able to access the region, I can't imagine that individuals will be free to explain that in fact their labor is coerced.
Right. There are, government organized tools for journalists, for diplomats to go to Xinjiang, and then they will show you the happy Uyghurs who are dancing and singing. That's the kind of thing they wanted to show you when you go to Xinjiang. There's no freedom. You can't really do independent investigation in the region.
I wanted to bring Sean Roberts into the conversation. Sean, would you mind unmuting and introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Sean Roberts. I'm an associate professor in the practice of international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University.
So, Sean, we are speaking, obviously ahead of the Olympics, but also ahead of a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, principally over the human rights abuses in Xinjiang or East Turkmenistan. I think one thing that was interesting to me was to see the degree to which America's international allies have gone along with this so-called diplomatic boycott. Do you see this boycott as having any meaningful impact on, if not sort of human rights conditions inside China more broadly, in how the international community approaches questions of human rights in China?
That's a good question. I don't think it has much direct influence on China's behavior. I do think it's important to note that while I'm sure the U.S. put a lot of diplomatic pressure to get other countries to sign on to this, there was also a lot of grassroots mobilization around it. And in European countries, there are numerous Uyghur organizations that have been working on this for some time. And I think, that may be the bigger sign that we see with this diplomatic boycott, is that I think the international community is realizing that if China doesn't change its domestic political behavior, it's going to become increasingly a problem in the international realm. That increasingly countries are more skeptical of dealing with China in any number of levels because there's questions about the country's intent.
So Yacho, in her remarks, cited commercial interests as, of course, driving some of the major Olympic sponsors in terms of their inability or reluctance to press China or even the IOC on human rights issues in China. I mean, just as the major corporations have sort of dueling interests when it comes to doing business in China, so too do major governments around the world, including the United States. I guess my question to you is, what's the right balance that a government, that the Biden administration specifically, ought to take in terms of prioritizing its interests in China? The Biden administration, of course, needs to work with China on things like global environmental pacts and other key issues of importance to U.S. foreign policy. But then you have, of course, like the worst crime known to humanity ongoing in China. How does one balance those priorities?
Well, I think it's important to not kind of set them up as a stark dichotomy. There's plenty of opportunity to both collaborate on global issues, which are in the interest of both the United States and China. And there's other opportunities to try to put pressure on China so that it recognizes what it's doing in the Uyghur region is not in their best interest. And I do think that the financial pressure is the best way to do that, because that's really China's power in the world. And, I think one of the things that's concerning me is that we do see a sense that the Uyghur issue starts getting wrapped up into geopolitical machinations, and that's not really helpful to the Uyghur people, I think, because then it kind of sets up two sides, the West and China. I think this is a humanitarian issue that the whole world has to be concerned about, not only because of what's happening to the Uyghur people inside China, but also because it sets a very dangerous precedent for the way that various states can go after separate ethnic groups, religious groups, and essentially try to forcibly assimilate them, destroy their identity, destroy their social capital. And I think that precedent is also problematic because it's being done in part through new technologies of surveillance that are really available to every country in the world. And the Chinese government's also marketing those technologies worldwide. And if there is not some sort of stance on what are the accepted behaviors of states within their borders, I think that we start losing any kind of semblance of the idea of human rights writ large.
I guess, to that end, is there a sort of specific policy prescription you would recommend to the Biden administration? They inherited the situation where I think it was the last day of the Trump administration in which Pompeo declared this to be a genocide. And, U.S. law sort of demands that, once a genocide is declared, something has to be done. Is there like a specific or discrete policy recommendation you would urge the Biden administration to strongly consider?
I do think that what it's been pursuing so far in terms of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act in particular could really put pressure on China in a way that is not, it doesn't signal full out conflict and confrontation, but it basically is trying to send a message to the elite within the Chinese Communist Party that things have started to get out of control within the country. And if we do want to be a leader globally, then we have to change what we're doing inside our borders, and we have to recognize some international norms of state acceptable state behavior. So I do think the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, if it is
Can you just
indeed,
explain very briefly what that act entails and demands?
well, the act demands that companies that operate in the United States, that sell their products in the United States, cannot have anything in their supply chain that has Uyghur forced labor involved in its production. Now, it also puts the onus on companies to police themselves, which a lot of companies have complained about, precisely because what was just said by my colleague from Human Rights Watch. It's very difficult to police your own supply chain within China. But beyond that, the question is, how is the United States going to actually implement that? How is the United States going to police that and ensure that companies are not violating that law? And it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's going to end up more generally forcing a lot of companies to minimize their production in China. They may still want to try to have the market for selling their goods, but they may start deciding that it's too dangerous to produce in China because a lot of the residential labor programs that have moved Uyghurs into factory settings have been also outside of the Uyghur region. So we see that there's factories that have been documented elsewhere in inner China that are tied to multinational corporations that are using Uyghur forced labor.
I do want to ask Rushan, like what comes next in terms of both your activism and the current situation on the ground and the current campaign against the Uyghurs? Are there any sort of key inflection points or key moments that you see after the Olympics as being key opportunities to once again raise the issue of these crimes against humanity and genocide on the international stage?
Thank you, Mark, giving me opportunity to talk about this again. Well, we are extremely frustrated with the international community and the United Nations. As I said earlier, there are a lot of talks, but no real action. And the situation back home, and not only it's not getting better, but it's getting worse. The people who had any kind of access to East Turkestan, or even our diplomats in Beijing, are saying the situation is far worse than what we are talking about, what everybody's reporting here.
In what way? Could you elaborate?
People are disappearing. There's no more Uyghurs on the streets. Han Chinese people are massively brought to the area. And the like Tesla just opening a new factory or shop in Urumqi, and the Hilton opening a hotel in a place that the Uyghur mosque was demolished, and all these Western corporations like Volkswagen, Siemens, and the other companies are public, like openly, widely investing in the area and using the Uyghurs as forced laborers. The Uyghurs are taken out of their homeland and sent to the forced labor facilities. And also the Uyghurs' homes are being reallocated to Han Chinese people, their land, their homes, and their assets and their money in the banks. So when you look at, the 10 stages of the genocide as the model that the UN or the US State Department use in taking steps to end genocide, classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, and the other ones like preparation or polarization, persecution,
routinization is one of them.
Yeah. So the last stage is denial. Well, they are saying that there's no mass graves or mass killings or gas chambers, but all these denials are coming out of the Western scholars or those so-called United Front or YouTubers or Canadians or Americans living in China, like this a person from Hawaii, Einar Tenjin. He is an American. I'm shamefully, saying that he's an American. He is basically being the CCP's mouthpiece, denying the anything about the Uyghurs or the genocide. So, what are we waiting for? One of the MEP from Italy, he said back in early 2019. When he gave a speech in the European Parliament, he said, colleagues, there's concentration camps are back. And what are we waiting for? Mass killings or gas chambers? Well, that's not going to happen because this is a modern day genocide. China is taking lessons from the World War II. The Chi Haotian, one of the Chinese government official, actually talked in one of his speeches why, in his opinion, why Nazi Germany and Japan lost during the World War II. Because there are so many things that, like why they lost, that they are taking that as lessons learned to hide the evidence, and they are manipulated the international community. And now they are sports washing the genocide, legitimizing the genocide tomorrow, inviting the international, the community for the opening ceremony. So it's the situation for Uyghurs is very, very grim, very frustrating. But now I am trying to warn the world that not just the sake of the Uyghurs, which the Uyghur Tribunal, after 3 hearings, delivered the verdicts that the Chinese Communist Party is committing a genocide against the Uyghurs. And we have overwhelming evidence from the former victims and the researchers. But I am saying this for the sake of the free world, the freedom and the democracy that your parents actually in this country and in Europe and United States worked so hard to establish last 50 years, last 70 some years. That's what's at stake. China is waging a war on freedom and democracy. If we don't stop China now, this is the last call. If we don't stop the communist Chinese regime now, just look at the Uyghur people's situation today and the picture, the future of the world that we are living for our children and our grandchildren in the future.
Thank you. Teng Biao, I wanted to ask you a similar question. What opportunities do you see, if any, are open, are sort of ripe to keep pressing on the human rights issue after the Olympics? Are there any sort of inflection points that are coming up, or otherwise, what strategies do you think will be most effective and impactful?
Thank you. It seems that Chinese government care less about human rights, about the pressures from the international community. But it's difficult, but there are something we can do and we should do. And there are some powerful tools, policies we already adopted like a Global Magnitsky Act and the Uyghur Human Rights Act and similar sanctions. So we should, punish those human rights abusers and the perpetrators and block them from entering United States and other free countries and freezing their assets. So that's one thing we can do. And another thing is the forced labor. So we should make sure take more steps to that the global business not involving in forced labor in Xinjiang and other areas. The consumers, we are all consumers, and we can do something to boycott or divide, and they must face consequences if those global business continue to be complicit in the forced labor and other crimes. They should be punished.
Yacho, same question to you. What else can be done, and are there any sort of other opportunities or inflection points coming up?
I completely agree with Teng Biao's 2 points. I just wanted to add one more is that, it's all about the money. The Chinese government is betting on, foreign companies is going to continue to carry to the government for market access. So that's the foreign, international business, including Intel, Airbnb. The other side is that there are a lot of Chinese companies are doing business outside of China, the surveillance company, all kinds of, the big Alibaba tech companies, also companies manufacturing things. So, and those companies are complicit in human rights violations in China, especially in Xinjiang, big surveillance companies like Hikvision. And those companies who are doing bad things in China should be banned from doing bad things, doing business outside of China for their actions inside China. This is another leverage that foreign governments can use to pressure the Chinese government to change behavior.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to our speakers for joining me live for this very important topic on really short notice. I do sincerely appreciate their taking the time to chat with me, and also they stuck around after I finished my questions for them to take questions from the audience. If you're ever interested in participating in one of these live tapings, just follow me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.